Welcome back to Adelphia's continuing coverage of the Green Party Convention in Denver. One of the first speeches of the weekend was given by Dr. Manning Marable. He was the founder of the Black Radical Congress. And here to introduce him is Elizabeth Horton Sheff, a Green Party member.
It is my great honor and privilege to introduce someone who has become a living part of my history. Every now and then we are graced to hear someone who can tell it like it is with such clarity that it makes you want to say, Dr. Manning Marable is one of those persons. He is professor of history and political science and the founding director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University in New York City. Born in 1950 in Dayton, Ohio, Dr. Marable was a founding director of Colgate University's Africana and Hispanic Studies program from 1983 to 1986. He was chairman of the Department of Black Studies at Ohio State University from 1987 to 1989. He was also professor of ethnic studies, history, and political science at the University of Colorado at Boulder from 1989 to 1993. Dr. Marable is a distinguished public author, and his books include Black Leadership, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, No Easy Victories, an anthology of Black radicalism from 1996 to the present, just to name a few. Personally, Dr. Marable came to Connecticut during my campaign and actually campaigned for me, so I am honored to see him here again, honored by his presence, and honored to have you hear what I heard that day he came to support me. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Manning Marable.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sisters and brothers of the Green Party, the great political challenge for the 21st century is the construction of a culture of human rights in the United States, the construction of a civil society that preserves individual rights but also protects those who are the most vulnerable, children, seniors, the poor, and the unemployed. The construction of a humane society that defends both the principles of freedom and equality. A just society that seeks the realization of human fairness and the dismantling of social institutions and policies that perpetuate discrimination and oppression based on race or gender or sexual orientation or physical disability or immigrant status. The Green Party can help to facilitate a national conversation moving us toward a culture of human rights, but only if we have the courage of our convictions and only if we are willing to speak truth to power. And so today, my sisters and brothers, let us speak truth to power. More than ever before, the vast majority of America's people, working class folk, members of trade unions, racial minorities, women, people on fixed incomes, the unemployed and the homeless, are being left behind economically and politically. We must redefine America's democratic project to make certain that the whole spectrum of cultures, classes, and communities, groups classified or identified by gender, race, or sexual orientation, that we all have a voice, that we all have a place at the national table. I'd like to concentrate this afternoon on several critical issues for the Green Party and for this country. First, American democracy is challenged by a series of crises that affect virtually everyone in this audience today. They are the crisis of racial inequality or structural racism, the crisis of economic inequality, the rapidly growing stratification or division between the wealthy versus the rest of us, and the rapid expansion of the working poor, people who have low-paying jobs or who are struggling just to survive. There is a crisis of incarceration, the unprecedented growth of a prison industrial complex. And fourth, the crisis of public education, with millions of our children falling further behind due to the deliberate underfunding of public education. All of these issues, the crises of race, of class, of prisons and schools, are all interconnected. You can't address any one of those issues without also connecting it to the others. In other words, there's no solution. There's no way to stem the growing numbers of poor people who end up in prison unless we also talk about what's happening in the dismantling of public education. You can't have a racially fair or just society when you're building 100 new prison cells a day in the United States. The task of the Green Party, the task of progressive folk, the task of the struggle for popular democracy in America is for us to make the connections in order for us to pull down the pillars of oppression. Second, I want to talk this afternoon about the positive steps that we can take toward transforming this society. Now, conservatives in both of the major corporate-dominated parties, the Democrats and Republicans, they will tell the American people that the crises that I've just outlined are caused simply by a lack of morality. I'm going to argue this afternoon that values are indeed important, that principles do matter in the articulation of politics. But what values do we uphold? What principles do we fight for and share? Whose side are we on in the crises that I've just outlined in American democracy? Should we learn more from those at the top of the society, or should we study and listen to those who are at the bottom of society? In the words of the great civil rights activist and theorist Ella Baker, what we need in this country is not leader-centered groups. We need group-centered leaders. What we need in this country is not democracy from the top down, it's democracy from the bottom up. And finally, there is a matter of vision. Without a vision, the people perish. How do we construct a common language? How do we create a common vision of humanity that can redefine the boundaries of political possibility? What does the Green Party bring to the long and difficult struggle to make and expand and enrich our understanding of democracy? What is the nature of the political struggle which the American people are facing as we stand at the beginning of the 21st century? The central issue that defines American society and politics for our time is the conflict between what could be termed the public versus the private. Can the people utilize the government as a means of addressing our basic social, economic, educational, environmental problems, or should we emphasize solely market-based initiatives, the corporate sector, to resolve issues like unemployment or poverty or education or housing? Nearly every significant policy debate in the United States in the last 20 years has really boiled down to one single question: should the people's interests or should the corporate interests be most important in our nation? That's the debate we have to raise in this country. The list of the struggle between the people's interests versus the corporate interests is virtually endless. In health care, President Clinton's 1994 proposal for managed health care tried to combine limited government mandates with privately run health provider corporations. So instead of pushing vigorously for the single-payer, comprehensive national health care system that millions of Americans desperately want and need, Clinton capitulated to private sector interests, and the whole thing failed. In public education, there's debate throughout the country on the issue of vouchers, whether parents should be subsidized to send their children to private schools. In public colleges, cutbacks in state and local funding have forced higher tuitions and fees, reducing the access of many racial minorities and working and poor folk to a quality education. In the areas of public housing and homelessness, state and city governments are aggressively cutting back funds. Increasingly, Republican and Democratic conservative politicians argue that the government should no longer even be in the business of public housing, that the market, that the corporations should determine the quality and the accessibility of housing. This debate also focuses on the criminal justice system. We are now spending $35,000 a year to maintain a single prisoner, one prisoner, in a minimum security jail cell. It costs nearly $80,000 a year to confine a prisoner in a maximum security jail cell. We are, as I said before, building over 100 new prison cells a day in the United States. In 1980, there were 500,000 people in U.S. prisons and jails. Today, it is 2 million. What does the Green Party have to say? What do we have to say about the struggle between the corporate interests and the people's interests? What are the struggles for human rights that should inform and inspire the Green Party and progressive politics in our nation today? Well, there is a struggle, a continuing struggle, of the well-to-do haves against the millions of have-nots, who are disproportionately African American, Latino, American Indian, women, and children. 4 decades ago, Michael Harrington's brilliant book, The Other America, documented the bitter realities of poverty and hunger in the United States. And despite the current economic expansion, despite the billions and billions of dollars, of millions of profits generated on Wall Street, millions on Martin Luther King Jr. Street, millions on Cesar Chavez Street, millions even on Main Street are being bypassed by that prosperity. The other America still exists. Where is that other America? America's working people are largely today divided into 2 groups. One upper tier that receives salaries that can only barely support a family, and a second tier that can be described as the working poor. These are full-time workers or people actively seeking work who nevertheless are trapped near poverty. It is that group, more than any other, that was most seriously threatened by the reactionary politics of the Welfare Act of 1996. It is that struggling working families that were targeted for virtual destruction by the Republicans' contract on America. The working poor remain largely hidden in this country, obscured from the light of an honest analysis by racist and sexist stereotypes about who is poor and who is unemployed and who is in public housing. The Green Party has to speak truth to power about the connection between race and gender and class and poverty in this country. In truth, the majority of American workers who earn more than the minimum wage but less than $30,000 a year are not black, they are not Latino, they are white. Most poor children live in working families. In fact, only 1/3 of all poor children live in families depending solely on public assistance. Always keep in mind that millions of Americans who live in public housing and millions of Americans who depend on food stamps are not African American. They are not Latino. They are white. My point is that we fall into a dangerous trap when we racialize poverty. My point is that progressives often fail to make the point that ultimately hunger is colorblind, and that in a racist society, because of racism, that poverty and unemployment are handed out in a racialized way. But for us to transcend the politics of division, we have to find the common ground. What is the challenge of the Green Party? And how do we make the connections? The only long-term solution to the crisis of the working poor is to fight for a comprehensive agenda for jobs and justice. Politically, we must support massive public works legislation where millions of working people can be hired to provide services and rebuild our cities. We should be training people to provide child care to working parents, health care, supportive services for seniors, improving our schools, and making our communities safer and drug-free. We should outlaw workfare and replace it with real jobs at living wages that can support families. We need to cut corporate welfare. We need to cut corporate welfare and tax abatements. The Green Party's support for economic justice, for community-based economics, and against the exploitation of labor move us in the right direction. But as long as trade unionists, working poor, people on public assistance are forced to compete against each other, nothing will ever change. The Green Party must say we must redefine the rules of the economic game. We must assert every person's right to a job or a guaranteed income, a living wage, especially for those who cannot work. The solution to the crisis of the working poor is the pursuit for the fight for jobs and justice for every person in America. The crisis of race and class that we see in the United States gets played out in part because of the growing economic stratification in this country. In the year 2000, the top 1% of all households had a greater combined net wealth than the bottom 90% of all U.S. households. In short, a very small number of households in the United States control the overwhelming majority of the nation's resources. And you can see this inequality played out in virtually every city and town in the United States. Between 1973 to 1989, the overall annual average of all wage earners living in cities in the United States fell by a real 16%, inflation adjusted. In Manhattan, where I live, the poorest 1/5 of the population in 1990 earned an average annual income of $5,237. The richest 1/5 earned an average income of $110,100 annually. In individual neighborhoods, less than 10 city blocks apart, the vast income gap between affluence and poverty can only be described as obscene. In East Harlem, in a Puerto Rican and a Latino neighborhood, the average annual family income in 1990 in one census tract was $6,019. 20 blocks away on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, in one census tract, the average income for affluent families in 1990 was $301,000. In other words, for every dollar that an affluent household in Manhattan has, the poor have 2 cents. These grim statistics reflect a draconian yet strategic decision made by America's corporate and political elite to redirect billions of dollars away from human needs spending, from health care, from public transportation, for job training programs, from public housing, toward the construction of a prison industrial complex that is today in our country destroying millions of people's lives. The clearest way for us to show this and to document this is pointing to the contradiction between incarceration versus education. A recent study produced by the Correctional Association of New York and the Washington, D.C. based Justice Policy Institute illustrates that in New York State, hundreds of millions of dollars have been stolen from the public university budget and reallocated toward prison construction. The report states that since fiscal year 1988 to fiscal year 1998, New York's public universities saw their operating budgets plummet by 29%, while funding for prisons rose 76%. In actual dollars, there has been nearly a one-to-one trade-off, with the Department of Corrections in New York State receiving $761 million increase during that 10-year period, while state funding for New York City and state university systems declined by $615 million. The basic impact on Black and Latino young women and men in New York State is that it is simultaneously much more easy to go to prison and much more difficult to attend college. There are more Blacks, 34,800. There are more Latinos, 22,400, locked up in prison than there are attending the State University of New York. Since 1989, there have been more African Americans entering the prison system in the state of New York for drug offenses each year than there were graduating from the State University of New York with undergraduate, master's, and doctoral degrees combined. This pattern of schools versus prisons in New York exists in virtually every state in this country. Thousands of Latino and Black young adults in California are denied access to state universities because of the passage of Proposition 209, destroying affirmative action. Thousands more have been driven out, and due to rapidly increasing costs for tuition and cutbacks in student loans. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions of dollars have been siphoned from the state's education budget and spent on building prisons. So in 1977, California had 19,600 people in its state prisons. By 1997, it had 160,000 people in prison. California today has the largest single prison system in the industrialized world, holding more inmates in jails and prisons than do France, Great Britain, Germany, Japan, Singapore, and the Netherlands combined. And these trends and these future trends are worse. The California Department of Corrections estimated that it will need to spend $6.1 billion in the next 10 years just to maintain its present prison system. With the exception of General Motors, there are more employees at work in the prison industry than any Fortune 500 corporation. So instead of funding teachers, we are hiring more prison guards. Instead of building new classrooms, we are constructing more jails. One of the central battlegrounds for democracy in the United States in the 21st century will be the effort to halt the dismantling of public education and public institutions in general for the expansion of this prison industrial complex. The Green Party's support for alternative sentencing for nonviolent offenders, for restoring voting rights to American citizens who have been convicted of felonies and then disfranchised in the country of their birth, the Green Party's support for an end to the widespread practice of racial profiling by not just the NYPD and the LAPD, but police departments across this country, that will advance the cause of racial justice. In electoral politics, the Green Party and other progressives must again make the connections by understanding why it is that the vast majority of Americans have such little faith or credibility in the American political process. People ask, why don't Americans vote? The simple answer is that the politicians we have to choose from seem completely disconnected from the real concerns and problems of our daily lives. Can anyone really imagine? Can anyone really conceive of Al Gore in the waiting room of a public hospital with a sick child? Can anyone really imagine George W. Bush paying for his groceries with food stamps or living in public housing? We'd like him there. We would like him there. But we can't imagine that right now. Part of our problem is structural. We have a winner-take-all electoral system with single-member congressional districts, and that means that the substantial minorities, up to 40% of a district's voters, have no voice to represent them in government. Congressional districts are constructed in a manner so that roughly 80% are non-competitive. That is, they are completely dominated by either the Democrats and the Republicans. The Green Party's position on this should be clear. A Green Party and progressive perspective must make the connections to the American people between money and the politics and power. Those in power keep their power by plowing money into the presidential, the congressional, and statewide electoral races. With billions of dollars in unregulated soft money contributions, you don't get a democratic government, you only get the best Congress that money can buy. Our entire political system is held hostage to corporate power. And there's only one solution. There's only one solution. Build a mass democratic movement to drive big money out of the electoral process once and for all. We need to democratize the electoral rules of the game to permit alternative voices and perspectives at the ballot box. Move away from winner-take-all elections to proportional representation. Make voter registration easier and accessible to all. The Green Party's vision of bottom-up democracy represents a real break from the top-down, corporate-dominated politics of the Republicans and the Democrats. The Green Party stand for an open government, opposing efforts to restrict access to public information. It stands in favor of free broadcast time for qualified candidates. Its advocacy of campaign finance reform offers a bold, common-sense alternative for a democratic America. The Green Party's 2000 platform and resolutions that I've seen offer a bold leadership on the issue of globalization. They support equitable, democratic, ecologically sustainable economics rather than corporate capitalism. It sensibly opposes nuclear power and the commodification of nature. It calls for democratically based mechanisms to deal with biotechnology while preserving biodiversity, indigenous rights, and food safety. But to win this fight, to win the fight around issues of environmental justice, to win the fight around racial justice, to win the fight against corporate power and for economic justice, means that we must cultivate the capacity to win the minds and the hearts of millions of people in order for us to finally take collective action to achieve our collective interests. Building a successful political alternative to globalized capitalism will take even more than that. It will mean the construction of a new political language and methods of organization to reach constituencies fragmented by gender, class, race, nationality, and language. It will demand that well-meaning white liberals will have to learn from and acknowledge the central roles of people of color in the struggles for democracy in this country. It will require building close cooperation with faith-based institutions, women's organizations, lesbian and gay organizations, organizations of low-income people, trade unions, and youth organizations in order to build a broad-based democratic mass movement for racial and economic and environmental justice. That's our task in the next 21st century. We must fight with a vision and a commitment to racial and social justice. Radicals sometimes think that as conditions worsen, oppressed people will become more desperate and will begin to demand basic change. That viewpoint is completely wrong. History shows that the capacity for resistance is always enhanced by the winning of small victories. To achieve real change, we must win over those with whom we share common interests, but who do not now believe in what we believe. This should not be considered a matter of political conversion or ideologically coercing people into submission, but by persuading them through our work and activities that meaningful, democratic, progressive change is possible. Small victories do matter, and when combined with a broad but radical social vision, the Green Party has the capacity, the Green Party has the energy, the Green Party clearly has the program to help lead in this struggle for justice. Let me conclude with one final observation. Oppressed people never struggle solely to realize abstract ideas. They struggle to improve their children's lives and their own lives within the real world here and now. What most exploited people want most are the tools to make meaningful changes in their environment and immediate circumstances. The developing struggle against corporate power, against globalization, must be informed by an overarching social vision of the realization of human rights, anchored in our analysis of the actual conditions confronting oppressed people in the third world and poor communities across the globe in order for us to achieve democratic change. Now, the Green Party in 2000 may not, perhaps may not, capture the White House. We may not, perhaps not, capture Capitol Hill. Stay with me for a second. We may not capture Capitol Hill in 2000, but by building this party, you build a small victory and a vision of the kind of democracy the American people desperately want and need. By building this party, you can help make the connections across the boundaries of race and class and sexuality and gender. By building this party, you can create an alternative vision of democratic, humanistic politics. You must never abandon the moral discourse to the far right. We must ask the kinds of hard moral questions that the Republicans and Democrats refuse to ask. We might ask the American people, what was more immoral, Clinton's sexual misconduct in the White House or his decision to sign the 1996 Welfare Act that pushed millions of women and children into poverty? I know I've got to end, but I got to ask you one more question. What was more immoral? George W. Bush's decision this week to send an innocent man to his death, or Al Gore's failure to denounce it? We must. Right. And I will close with this saying. One of my favorite quotations is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin used to say, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The moral arc is long. It's very, very long, but it bends toward justice. How does the Green Party, how do progressives in this country, how do progressive folk who are struggling for freedom and democracy and racial and social justice throughout the world, how do we bend that moral arc of the universe toward justice? We bend it toward justice by celebrating our passionate discontent with the way things are. contented people rarely want things to change too much. If you want to find out how do we bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice, we should never wallow in the mainstream. We need to stand at the edge. We need to stand at the boundaries. We need to learn from those who have little or nothing to lose. We need to understand and feel the anxiety of 44 million Americans today who lack any medical insurance. We need to spend time working in a homeless shelter. We need to walk a picket line with trade unionists. To bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice means to be passionate in our discontent with the way things are. It is to challenge conformity. It is to push the boundaries of the way things are to the way things should be. The Green Party can push the boundaries of the way things are to the way things should be. We can bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice only if we are willing to speak truth to power, only if we're willing to make the connections, and only if we are willing to struggle, because without struggle, there can never be any progress. And as we struggle, and as we have faith, and as we have commitments that transcend the boundaries of division, then we shall create that just society. We can create a new democracy. We can create genuine freedom and equality for all Americans, only if we have a commitment to fight, and we will win. Thank you.
That was Dr. Manning Marable, an author and co-founder of the Black Radical Congress.